I will say that the topics today could be a little heavy at times because we are talking about sort of negative experiences in math and sort of maybe ways that you're being treated that are not fair or not how you should be treated. And so I know I've given talks in the past where talking just about my own experience in math, where people have been sort of caught off guard by sort of some of the heavy topics that come up. So I just want to sort of preface it by saying that, like, if you need to step away or like this isn't the right time for you to sort of engage in this conversation, that's fine. I'm not really going to be talking about my specific experiences in today's talk as much as trying to outline a little bit more sort of big picture ideas about the sort of types of different sort of pseudo norms or toxic norms that we have in math, and ways that maybe you can sort of strategize about how to deal with them. So it won't be sort of, if you've gone to some of the talks I've given before where it's sort of really about my experience, this one is going to be a little bit more big picture, and hopefully we can sort of engage together talking about maybe some of the experiences that you folks have had. Okay, so just, yeah, to reiterate, right, what is the sort of description about this, of the webinar is about these sort of norms or sort of interactions that you're sort of told are normal, even if they're maybe not what you should be expecting or not the way that you should be treated. And so I wanted to sort of start off by just noting that sort of in academic math, I would say that toxicity really is the norm. I think this is the norm in like a lot of our academic and mathematical spaces and our departments. And I want that to sort of be sort of the baseline that we'll all have as we sort of approach this discussion, is that this kind of can complicate a lot of factors, because it means that all of us are sort of conditioned to accept a certain level of mistreatment that maybe we shouldn't. And so there is going to be some distinguishing as we go between sort of the mistreatment that sort of everyone is experiencing and the mistreatment that maybe you might experience sort of specifically depending on your identities. So I think it is pretty normal to be mistreated by your peers. I think that people have had bad experiences in the classroom. I certainly had bad experiences as a graduate student in math. I think many people, when you get to this stage of starting to go to academic conferences, you can have negative experiences, even in terms of like giving talks and having people sort of undercutting your expertise and knowledge, or trying to sort of one-up you. I think this is sort of very typical that a lot of people experience in math. I think a lot of people have like bad experiences with their advisor, whether it be sort of specifically sort of like harmful things that their PhD advisor does, or just sort of like a general level of like neglect, of like them not really thinking about your professional future, not really thinking about ways to guide you. I think this is very common. I certainly have many, many friends of sort of all different backgrounds who have had very bad experiences with their advisors. I think it's normal to experience sort of microaggressions in academic spaces, like both in the classroom and out of the classroom. Of course, this is sort of exacerbated depending on your identities. So what do I mean here by microaggression? So here's my explanatory comma, what I mean by microaggression. So here, these are often sort of these interpersonal and often like sort of unintentional manifestations of like structural inequality, right? These sort of harmful stereotypes and tropes and sort of like internalized isms. So, right, like whether someone is sort of making a comment like, oh, like you got an A on that exam, because they're like, didn't think that you were doing well in the class, or didn't think you were keeping up because like you're a woman and you're like, there's only 3 women in the class and they just didn't think they were the top students. Or like, oh, are you like, can you, like, you're at a conference and someone's like, oh, could you like point me where the food is for lunch, because they think you're like one of the hotel workers because you're Black and they don't think that you're one of the conference participants, right? Like all of these sort of these things which happen on sort of these interpersonal ways where people make assumptions about like who you are and why you belong in that space or how you belong in that space because of the way they perceive you, right? So one thing I just want to say is like this term micro is not to say that these sort of have small impacts, right? Like I think microaggressions have really big impacts on the people experiencing them, but this was sort of introduced to try to explain the fact that these are sort of small instances of like sort of much bigger structural issues, right? That these are sort of small manifestations of bigger problems, but the impact of them can be really, really damaging. Okay, and of course, sort of all of these experiences, right, of like sort of microaggressions in the classroom, or sort of being neglected by your advisor or professors, or being mistreated by your peers, like these things can all be sort of exacerbated when you carry different marginalized identities, right? And you sort of have to navigate the different intersections of those things. And so one thing that I also want us to keep in mind throughout the talk is, right, like all of us have our own identities and experiences. And it's important that we don't sort of gloss over other people's identities or experiences because of our own, and we sort of are aware of the ways that these things intersect. So again, just another sort of establishing some common vocabulary for us. That this intersectionality, I want to think of this is sort of a term that was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw as like the complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experience of marginalized individuals or groups, right? So everyone sort of is carrying their own identities, and how those identities sort of manifest in their experiences in math is going to be different. So I love, this is one of my only appearances in math Twitter, but Dr. Noel Sawyer, who gave the Hidden Norms talk last month, has like this tweet, which I think just encapsulates what I think about when I'm thinking about intersectionality. And so Noel's tweet says, "It's a real party being a Black woman in academia, because did you speak down to me because you're generally a terrible person? Is it because you think I'm a student and you're rude to them? Is it because I'm Black, a woman? Please label your rudeness, sir, that I may react accordingly." Because, right, like when you have a lot of different identities, it's very hard to know like sort of what aspect of it somebody is reacting to. And so I think it's why a lot of times I feel discomfort in conversations, for example, that focus on just being a woman in math. Because like to me, like I don't know what it means to be a woman in math separated from my other identities. Like my identity as a Black woman, as an Indigenous woman, like I don't know what it means. Like, am I being treated this way because you see me as being non-white, or am I being treated this way because you see me as not being a man? Like, and so like if you try to like sort of separate out each one to talk about them, usually it sort of is ignoring people who are experiencing many things at once. So like as much as possible, of course, there's lots of identities I don't carry, right? Like I'm able-bodied, and I don't know what the experience of like navigating math, for example, with a disability would be like. So I just want us to keep in mind that like no matter how the ways that we're marginalized, there's probably things that we aren't experiencing, and it's important to sort of just hear and understand that people might be experiencing things differently because of that. Okay, so I've said like all of these sort of bad things in math are normal, but of course that doesn't make them okay, right? Normal just means it's common. Normal is not, I don't want to sort of normalize it in saying that like, oh, it happens a lot, so that's fine, right? We just have to, it is what it is. Like, we just have to live with it. Like, sucks to be us, but like, that is what it is. That's not what I'm here to do, right? Like, just because something is common doesn't mean that we should accept it or think that we should sort of let it persist the way it is. But it is sometimes helpful to recognize sort of things that are happening sort of more sporadically, or things that are happening sort of to people all the time. Okay, so I just want to point that out, right? Normal is common. Normal does not mean okay. And I don't want to say that it is at all. Okay, so of course, right? Like not only do we have this sort of normalized toxicity in academic spaces, but like we also have like extremely hierarchical systems, right? I'm sure you've experienced like just being in a classroom, and the fact that like at the end of the day, the professor is sort of the be all end all in the classroom. They decide sort of what your grade is. They decide what the structure for the class is. They decide sort of what is happening. And sort of in the department more broadly, there's often very sort of hierarchical modes, right? Like often sort of there is the undergraduate students. If you're in a department that has a graduate program, then there's graduate students who sort of have more power and influence, but they still are sort of only there temporarily, so they don't have as much impact as like a faculty member. And then a faculty member who's like tenure track but doesn't have tenure yet, like they're also like kind of like trying to keep things like a little bit even keel because they want to make sure that they don't risk the next steps for them, which is getting tenure, and like so on and so forth. There's sort of like all these ladders that we're all climbing. And it means that everybody is always sort of feels like there's people above them that they're like sort of at the beck and call of, or sort of that they need to sort of treat in a certain way to make sure that they can secure their next step. And because of this, I think that this introduces many like very strong power dynamics, which leave people vulnerable to abuse. And so what I want to sort of compare and contrast for us through this is the idea of sort of things which are sort of normal, toxic but normal, versus sort of something that is sort of a true pseudo norm, something that is sort of being told to you specifically because of the power someone holds over you and sort of whatever your identities are, in a way that is not the case for sort of your peers. So of course, this is me just trying to sort of give us words to talk about this. This is not saying that this is sort of the best way or the only way to describe this, or that these things are sort of completely distinct. But I want to sort of make a little bit of a dichotomy between sort of these two different types of toxic things that we can see happen. So I'm going to call it toxic norms versus pseudo norms. Okay. So a toxic norm, I want to say this is like a negative experience that is sort of widely shared within a community, regardless of your individual background or identity. Whereas a pseudo norm, I want to say, is a negative experience that you are sort of expected to accept as normal, but is not typical for other individuals in your community or those with sort of different marginalized identities than your own. Okay, so I want us to start distinguishing a little bit from what is sort of the general toxic culture versus sort of specific toxicity that is happening maybe because of your identity or because of the power that someone is holding over you. Okay, so I have on the next slide a list of sort of norms, and I want us to talk through each one and have folks decide whether they think it's sort of a toxic norm or pseudo norm. Okay, so here's my list. So I'll just read them all out first, and then we can go over them one by one. Okay, so the first year of grad school is isolating, overwhelming, and makes you feel inadequate. Okay, so here's a norm. Okay, another one. If you're struggling with first year graduate classes, maybe you should consider career options outside of math. Grad school isn't for everyone. That's another norm. Okay, here's another one. You should continue to collaborate with someone even if you have had very bad experiences with them. Just focus on the math. Your advisor threatens to remove your name from a forthcoming paper after an unrelated disagreement. They tell you that this is their prerogative as the most senior author. Okay, so let's start with the first one. I guess I should have thought more about how to do this, but I feel like people can put like, I'll just ask and people can put like in the chat toxic norm or pseudo norm. And if anyone like wants to like share their thoughts on why after we've had a chance to vote, maybe we could do that. So let's do this with the first one. Do people think this is like a toxic norm or a pseudo norm, that the first year of grad school is like isolating, overwhelming, and makes you feel inadequate? So I see a couple toxic norms in the chat. Anyone else want to chime in? Another toxic norm. Oh, a couple pseudo norms. Okay, so I see when Dwight, toxic but pseudofied real quick. Yes, I love that. So actually, let me like advance my slide one more, because I think that Dwight just put something in the chat that's really important, right? That like this distinction that I'm making is like not a true distinction, because toxic norms, even if they're sort of commonly experienced, are often weaponized specifically against marginalized students. So I'll give an example of this, and maybe this can also help clarify sort of what I'm talking about between sort of in making this distinction, which of course, again, this is a distinction where there's like a lot of fuzziness, right? There's a lot of sort of potential overlap, and depending on sort of your point of view, you could sort of put in either one category. But here's an example that for me feels like an example of sort of what Dyke's talking about, where a toxic norm gets pseudified, okay? Which is like, for example, thinking about imposter syndrome. Okay, so imposter syndrome, right, is often characterized as sort of like this persistent internalized fear of being found out as a fraud. And so like you're in a space, but you sort of have this voice in your head, which is like, maybe I'm not good enough to be here. Maybe I don't belong here. Like maybe I'm just tricking everybody into thinking that I should be here, but eventually I'm going to be discovered as a fake, right? Eventually my cover is going to be blown. I'm going to be found out. So imposter syndrome is something that a lot of people experience in math, because math is an extremely competitive space, right? Where there are many sort of places where people get weeded out. And so every stage, people have a lot of like sort of survivor's guilt and like feeling like maybe they shouldn't have been the ones to make the cut. But how does this turn from sort of a toxic norm that people are experiencing widely to sort of a pseudo norm? Often, and I have experienced this myself, marginalized students are specifically told out loud by their peers, by faculty, by their advisors, that they actually don't belong, that they aren't cut out for math, that they don't have what it takes, that they got in because of affirmative action or because so-and-so put in a good word for them or for all these other things. And so they are having external voices explicitly telling them that they are not good enough to be there. So when someone tells a marginalized student who is being explicitly told by outside people that they don't belong, that they're experiencing imposter syndrome, that's a pseudo norm. Because they're equating this like specific bad experience that this marginalized person is having because of their peers and faculty with the experience of someone who just has their internal voice of self-doubt. Those are two very distinct experiences. And saying just because someone can overcome their imposter syndrome, someone who is facing external barriers should also just bootstrap themselves out of that situation is a pseudo norm that only these marginalized students are expected to conform to. So I think this is a very good example of like that this distinction, right? It's not sort of a sharp line, right? These things sort of cross over and there's a lot of interplay here. Okay, so let's go back. Also thank you, Daniel, for putting my little definitions in the chat. Very helpful. Okay, so for me, I think of the sort of this first example of the first year of graduate school being isolated, overwhelming, and making you feel inadequate. I think of this as being a toxic norm. Because I know so many graduate students. I interact with graduate students a lot, and I have sort of over the last, how long has it been since I started grad school? Like 9 years with graduate students. And so like, this has been something that has been expressed very widely to me, regardless of people's identity, regardless of sort of their background. There's this feeling of sort of isolation that for many people just accompanies the fact that you're uprooted from wherever you lived in undergrad to like a new place with new people with no support system, right? And expected to start a new huge undertaking in your life with very little support. And so this tends to be sort of a very common experience for a lot of people, regardless of their identities. But also students who, for example, like myself, was coming into like a predominantly white graduate program as a woman of color, also had sort of other bad experiences that were happening in my first year. And so I agree with Dwight that this can sort of turn into a pseudo norm really quickly. Because if your bad experience that is happening because people are actually like discriminating against you is being compared to the same bad experience that other people are just having because it's a big new experience and they're sort of isolated from family, that's not the same thing. Okay, so again, all of these things, there's sort of lots and lots of discussion, but I just want to sort of give us a sort of frame of reference. Okay, so what about this second one? How do people feel about this? So if you're struggling with first year graduate classes, maybe you should consider career options outside of math. Grad school isn't for everyone. Okay, so I see a toxic because common, but heavily weaponized. I see lots of pseudo. Yeah, and I see another toxic, but it can be weaponized. Yeah, so I would say in my experience, of course, all of this is dictated by my own experiences and like the people that I know and the people I've talked to and what has been shared with me. But in my experience, this is something that is very, very, very heavily skewed towards marginalized students. I do not know, for example, of any white men in my program who were told this in their first year of grad school. But I know of many women of color who've been told this, and students of color who've been told this. Okay, so I think this is one where I've heard for other students that's like, oh, it's normal to be challenged as you make the transition from undergraduate courses to graduate level courses. Like, don't worry about it. This is normal. And then I hear for other students, like, oh, if you're not doing well, maybe you just aren't really cut out for this. Okay, so I think this one can tend to be a pseudo norm. And often it happens in the sort of dynamic of you talking to like one of your first year professors. And so again, there's this very strong power dynamic of you as a student talking to this person who holds a lot of power over you and over your future, right? And their perception of you, of whether they think you're going to be ultimately successful or whether they think you're cut out to be a mathematician, it also has a very real impact on what grade they assign you and how they sort of read your performance. And so this is not only, in my opinion, a pseudo norm, but it's a pseudo norm that has very real impacts on sort of your trajectory in your graduate program. Okay, so what about this next one? You should continue to collaborate with someone even if you've had very bad experiences with them. Just focus on the math. I see a lot of pseudo. Pseudo. Interesting. See, so this is really depending on like people's own experience. Because for me, I would identify this as a toxic norm. I would identify this as a toxic norm, which has disproportionate impact on marginalized individuals. Okay, so I think that this is a very common thing, that there's an expectation that the math comes above everything else. I think that this is just sort of a common norm in mathematics, that math comes above everything else and publications are king. You need those publications. Your currency is publications, like everything rests on publications. And so I know many people of all different identities and backgrounds who are encouraged to continue collaborations regardless of the experiences they've had with those particular set of collaborators in order to just get that paper out. Just get it out. And like after that, you can do whatever you want, but like you can't walk away from math. That can happen. And so I think that this is a toxic norm that is sort of very widespread. I think that it can have disproportionate effects on marginalized people because I think, for me at least in math, I have so many places where people are telling me I don't belong in math that for me, it is extremely damaging to have that enter into like sort of the closeness of a collaborative environment. And so I think for me, that advice would be extremely destructive to my career overall, because I think it would be so derailing to have even for what for me are usually sort of my nourishing math spaces become as toxic as the rest of my math spaces. But I think for a lot of people with majoritized identities, they have other good and sort of wholesome places in math. And so they can afford to have this one place be a little bit toxic and get what they need out of it and move on. And so I think this is a toxic norm that is often weaponized specifically against marginalized people. To be clear, toxic norms, again, they're norms because they're normal, but I don't think they're okay, right? I don't think any of these norms are okay, but I do think that they're common and normal, okay? And so then last one, your advisor threatens to remove your name from a forthcoming paper after an unrelated disagreement. They tell you that this is their prerogative as the most senior author. Okay, so toxic norm, pseudo norm. So I see a toxic, I see very, very toxic, 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 lots of toxic. Okay, so for me, this is a pseudo norm. Why do I think of this as being a pseudo norm? I think of this as being a pseudo norm because it involves a very specific power dynamic that your advisor has over you. Your advisor is someone who is going to be your PhD advisor for the rest of your career. If you graduate with your PhD with that advisor, that's it. They are always going to be your advisor. They're always going to be attached to you professionally. This is, for me, it's not necessarily because of your sort of personal identities in terms of like your race or your sexuality or your whether you're disabled or not, or whether anything like that, but it is because of your identity as their student and the power that they hold over you as an advisor. And for me, in my experience, this sort of advisor-advisee relationship or mentor-mentee relationship is often the place that pseudonorms thrive. Because so much of academia is built around your sort of attachment to a single person. And as a grad student, that attachment tends to be your PhD advisor. And so like you are sort of under their thumb in a very real way because they have the power to sever you in so many ways from your sort of wider mathematical community. Okay, so again, I'm happy that there's been sort of this disagreement between like what I'm thinking a toxic norm is and what other people, because this is showing that all of these things sort of are reflective of your sort of other experiences and sort of what's happening in the communities around you. Okay, but I do sort of want to emphasize that for me, it's really this sort of different distinction in the power that's being held over you in a pseudo norm versus a toxic norm, and the way that it's sort of being applied in this sort of individual way. Okay, so again, we've sort of talked about how toxic norms are sort of specifically weaponized against marginalized people. So what are we doing then? I've talked about sort of all of these rough, terrible things that are going on. So what do I want us to get out of this workshop then? Okay, I don't want us just to walk away with like a new way to describe bad things. I also want us to think about sort of some strategies that we can develop to help us maintain high expectation for how we deserve to be treated and how the people around us deserve to be treated. Okay, even when people are saying we deserve less, whether that's because it's sort of the norm that everyone around us is being treated badly, or because the person who's telling us that we deserve less is sort of wielding a lot of power over us. Okay, and so I think, again, because of this sort of very hierarchical nature of math and the fact that there's so many sort of weed out and weed out spots that happen and sort of gatekeeping that happen, there can develop an attitude that like, if you made it here, you should just be happy that you did. And you should be happy with whatever you get because you're lucky that you made it. You're lucky that you got into this good undergrad. You're lucky that you got into this good grad school. You're lucky that you got this postdoc. You're lucky that you got a tenure track job. At every stage, there's sort of this feeling that we should just be grateful. We should be grateful that we made it and we don't deserve to ask for more. And so what I want us to walk away from is with the idea that we should always be willing to ask for more for ourselves and the people around us until we are all being treated with humaneness, with dignity, and with respect. Okay, that is what we deserve. And anything less than that is toxic. Okay, and that is a hard, very difficult standard to hold for yourself in a sort of space which is always degrading our value and the value of those around us. It's hard not to internalize that we deserve less. Okay, so if the only thing you take away from this is to say, whatever you say I deserve more, that's good, because it's true. Okay, so like, let's sort of go forward with that attitude. Okay, so what are some strategies that I wanna sort of lay out? Well, I think it sort of depends a little bit whether what you're experiencing is a toxic norm or a pseudo norm. And again, as we've already discussed, there's a lot of fluidity here. So like, I'm happy for us to sort of discuss how these things are sort of non-distinct, there's sort of overlapping interaction happening. But it's sometimes nice to like have some ways of identifying a little bit more carefully what exactly you're going through, because that can help you shape your response in a way that's going to be best for you. Okay. So toxic norm or pseudo norm, how do we decide, right? Like, how do we figure out? So again, maybe this will help sort of elucidate my definitions. So these are going to be my red flags for a pseudo norm. Okay. And again, we can talk about if there's sort of other red flags, other things that you've experienced. But for now, here's just a few red flags. So red flag number 1, if what is being painted as normal for you is not the experience or expectation for your majoritized peers, it might be a pseudo norm. Okay, that's a red flag. If something is being painted as normal for you that you know is not the normal experience for people around you, that's a little bit of a flag on the play. Okay, so here's one red flag. Here's another red flag. What is being painted as normal for you is not supposed to be discussed with others, not supposed to be talked about with your peers, not supposed to be talked about within your department. Big red flag. Why, if this is normal, should this not be talked about, right? Why can't you discuss this with others? Why can't you get other feedback? Why can't you get other input? Why can't you get other advice? If someone is trying to isolate you from discussing the situation that you're going through with other people that you trust, that's a huge red flag. Okay. And then I think the biggest red flag of all is if what is being painted as normal for you feels like it's compromising your personal values and ethics. If you feel like you're being put in a position that compromises your core values, red flag. Someone is probably exercising their power over you to convince you to do something that they want that is not good or healthy or normal for you. Okay, this is, for me, these are sort of big red flags. That your experience is sort of somehow being made distinct from the people around you, that you're not allowed to discuss that experience with the people around you, and that you're being asked to compromise yourself and who you are for this to happen. Okay, not okay. None of these things should be being asked of you. Okay, this is a huge red flag. Okay, so I want to take a pause. I'm talking too much and I'm losing my breath. So let's have some discussion. Okay, discussing questions. So I have a couple of questions. Let's start with the first one. Like, does anybody else want to throw in the chat some things that they feel are characteristics that distinguish a toxic norm from a pseudo norm?
I'll throw something out there that related to what you said already. A lot of toxic norms, I believe, are trackable, like recordable, something like there's research often done in different ways than the pseudo norms. I mean, research is done on both, but I think I think pseudo norms are debated more.
There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of like, oh, is that really a problem? That's why I said about compromise, like it feels like it might be compromising your beliefs, right? Because it's sort of pushing your boundaries. It's like, well, maybe it's fine, but you sort of feel like you're being asked to push back against what you feel is sort of the limits for yourself, right? That sort of grayness. I think that's a great observation.
I think that pseudo norms can often like emerge in like a very compartmentalized way where it's something that's like very specific to like one or just like a couple of people or like one group or one sort of figure of authority that maybe a lot of people who have worked with like this person have like similar experiences and it's just sort of normalized. But then like, yeah, that's like not something that should be tolerated from like any advisor, and that like a typical or like a healthy advisor wouldn't do, but like within sort of like the insular group of the person of authority, like within their sort of sphere of control, like it becomes normalized in like that like smaller setting.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation from Maya, that maybe this isn't something that's sort of normal among your peer group, But maybe if you zoom in on like all the people who are in the class with this person, or all the people who have this person as your advisor, as their advisor, like maybe within these sort of smaller communities, there's sort of this normalization that happens where it's like, oh, you all sort of share this experience. You all are like excusing this experience, right? You all sort of give rationalizations and justifications for why this is okay. And you aren't really sort of discussing it with people who maybe would shine sort of an outside perspective on it. I think that's a really good point, that you can sort of, it can turn into sort of a toxic norm within this sort of smaller, more insular group, right? Where you sort of like, oh, well, that's just how this is here. That's what they're like. I also see a comment from Asmita in the chat that says, I feel like with toxic norms, I could discuss with peers, but for pseudo norms, I keep things to myself because there's no one in my department who looks like me. This is like a really, right? When you don't feel like there's anyone in your department who might share that experience, it's very hard to tell anyone about it, because you don't want someone, I know this happened to me in undergrad. I had a professor who was harassing me for quite some time. And it was not until I left for a summer program and ended up sharing during the summer with some of like my roommates what was going on, that like it was really, I really realized what was happening, because there was no other women in my class in computer science in my undergrad. And so there was not other women interacting with this professor who I could sort of talk to and be like, is this what is happening? Is this normal? And so it took like being in a completely different setting with people who I felt like had more similar experiences to me to like actually sort of have it exposed as something that was like not okay. And so I think this is really insightful, that often when you're sort of isolated as feeling like you're the only one who has the experiences you're having, that like you don't feel like it's something you can open up about. Whether because you think they won't understand, or you think they're going to blame you as the sort of causing the problem, or whatever these reasons, right? That's a really isolating and damaging experience. So thank you for sharing that, Asmita. Okay, so how about the second one? So this one, no one needs to put anything in the chat, but like I want us to just pause for like 2 minutes and think about this second question. And because I don't want anyone to feel like they have to share any experience here, right? Like it's only if you feel like comfortable, that's like something that you are empowered to share. This is not a time for that I want to ask anyone to feel like they need to sort of display their trauma or sort of share these things, right? These things you should only be sharing at your own pace as you feel empowered to do so, as you feel safe to do so. Okay, so this is more just for us to reflect. And if you feel called to share, that's totally okay, and I welcome that. But like, I don't think that this is something you should feel compelled to, right? I don't want anyone to feel like they're needing to like sort of put their pain on display for other people. So let's just take like a couple minutes to think about this, which is, have you experienced a toxic norm in your department, or a pseudo norm in your department? Or do you know sort of people close to you who have? And so just taking some time to reflect on that, sort of what has your experience been in your department, in your classes? So like, I'll just pause for a minute. It's hard for me to be quiet, but I'm gonna look at the clock and I'll make sure I'll be quiet for a minute. Okay, so I took my minute. I timed myself to make sure. If anyone wants to share anything, this is the opportunity to do so. I will just sort of start by saying that like I have, I think in my undergraduate department, I experienced more pseudo norms than toxic norms. I think for the most part, like a lot of the sort of general experiences were really good. And I think especially with my math professors, I had just like really wonderful, encouraging, affirming experiences. And in my cohort in math, just very positive, kind, excellent peer group. And so I think in undergrad, I had a few experiences of sort of pseudo norms with faculty, but I think for the most part that it was a very positive and warm environment. I don't think I experienced sort of a lot of sort of toxic norms. And then I think when I transitioned to grad school, it sort of flipped. I think I immediately started experiencing a lot of toxic norms that are sort of common in math that I didn't realize, because like my own little area of math in undergrad was just so lovely that it was sort of a big shock to sort of have this. And so I internalized a lot of those experiences as being unique to me, because I didn't know that they were things that people around me were experiencing until sort of later on when I felt more comfortable sharing. And then there was a lot of things that I recognized at the time as being pseudo norms, sort of things that people would tell me, the ways that people would treat me, that I saw as being very distinct from what was happening to my sort of more majoritized peers. And so that was sort of a big shock. And then I think continuing into my postdoc, I think I experienced the toxic norms continued, but like by the time I got to a postdoc, I had identified a lot of those as sort of what are the common things that are happening to a lot of people that are sort of generally sort of a byproduct of the sort of unthoughtful way we structure academia and the sort of very hierarchical way that we structure academia. And then I experienced a lot of pseudo norms as a postdoc, things that were happening specifically to me that I was sort of expected to accept as normal, because of who my postdoc mentor was, because of sort of the way that that group was built, and that it took some time to sort of disentangle myself from. So for me, it has been different sort of at each stage, depending on sort of who the senior person in my group is and sort of the way that I am sort of positioned in that group. Okay, so I'll open it up if anyone wants to share anything. Again, absolutely no pressure. But I do think it's good for us to spend that time reflecting on it, because I think the more time that we spend sort of reflecting and understanding the ways that we're experiencing things and why, it can help us sort of recognize that things are happening in a little bit more of that a lot of the times that we experience these things is happening because of a lack in ourselves or happening because of sort of structural things that we're running into. And for me, it's been really beneficial in my journey to like take the time to identify what those are, because it takes a lot of the weight off of myself as being sort of responsible for the core experience I'm having, and sort of helps me identify what the things that are actually causing that are, and finding ways to sort of join with other people to start to like maybe shift some of those norms and change some of those problems and fix some of these things. Okay, so this really brings me to sort of my next strategy, which is community as an antidote for harm. Okay, so for me, this has been far and away the most important thing that has sort of moved me through each stage of my mathematical journey, is having people around me supporting me and me supporting them, and being engaged in community of people who recognize my full humanity and sort of support me as a human and as a mathematician, and who don't make me sort of choose between like sort of what identity I'm embodying. Okay, so for me, I think of this in sort of two ways. And again, I want to emphasize that these are just like, I just made these up to try to articulate my experiences. These are not hard and fast things. But for me, this sort of helped me give some framework for discussing this. And so I think the ways that I think about community as an antidote for harm, it really does depend on sort of the type of thing that you're experiencing. Okay, so for me, toxic norms are something that just cannot stand in a truly supportive and care-based community, because they're sort of predicated on the expectation that we will all suffer. And so when we as a community say no, they can't stand up anymore, because we say like, no, we deserve more than this, right? And so for me, like sort of toxic norms like don't even make sense in sort of a community that is driven by support and care for each other. And so that's why for me, I really think I didn't experience many toxic norms as an undergrad, because I think I was in a community that was so supportive and so care-based that there wasn't sort of so much normalized suffering. And so I think that was something that was that they just can't stand up. Once we say like no, they're gone. I think this is different than pseudo norms, where pseudo norms sort of thrive. They can even happen when you don't have those toxic norms, because not having toxic norms doesn't mean not having hierarchies and power structures. And so I think those sort of really distinct power dynamics introduce the presence of pseudo norms, even if sort of the general culture maybe is better. And I think these are things which sort of thrive in silence and isolation. Okay, so in my thinking, again, this is open for discussion and debate and growth and sort of and thinking through more. But for me, I feel like toxic norms are the perfect place for collective action, right? Because these are things which are widely experienced regardless of sort of individual identity. And so people can sort of come together around them to push for change, even in their sort of local community, right? I think in every grad school, there are many students who are sort of suffering from a lack of support during their sort of initial grad school years. And I think that's something that like students can all organize together to say like, hey, what do we need from our department that would have made that experience less torturous, right? And so I think these sort of toxic norms are a great place to start organizing with your peers and coming up with ideas for change and pushing for that, okay? So for me, sort of when I think of sort of toxic norms, I think that this is like a space ripe for sort of collective action, for us really coming together and saying like, hey, no, this is not what I want our community to be, and this is not the expectation that we should have. We should not have an expectation of suffering. Okay. And again, I think of this as being sort of a little bit different from pseudo norms, right? Because pseudo norms are often sort of very localized to you, right? Someone has power over you and someone is abusing that power to make you feel like you have to accept treatment that is not okay. But they are likely, this is often how abuse works, they're likely treating other people very differently, right? This is very common for people to like choose their victims specifically, mistreat them, but maintain a very different public face. Because this discredits people when they come forward, right? Because someone comes forward and says like, this is the experience I had, but the abuser has like 100 people who they've treated well. And they're like, no, but look at all these people I treated well. How could I ever treat this person bad? Right? So I think it's a little bit different the way that you have to think through this, especially because often the stakes here are much more high for you personally. So again, I'm open to sort of push back on any of these things. But when I was thinking through this, I think when we're thinking of these sort of pseudo norms, it really is important to have trusted people that you can confide in. And so this, right, is important because you want to make sure that you can sort of share this experience in a way that is safe for you and doesn't open you up to further harm. Okay, so I think this is already just sharing when bad things are happening to you in a way that you feel very isolated from others is very hard. And I think that this is something you need to take at your own pace. And I think it's important to have sort of some trusted friends, some trusted accomplices, hopefully some people maybe who have more power in the situation than you. But even just starting with people who are maybe completely outside of the situation can be good. Just making sure that you're sharing with other people and trying to sort of get support for this. Okay, because again, that silence and isolation makes everything be a burden that you have to carry alone. Okay, so again, I think pseudo norms are not necessarily as commonly experienced locally. I think they are very persuasive, like very, very pervasive. I think anything you're experiencing, probably there's many other people experiencing it, but maybe not in your institution or like in your research group or like sort of in a way that you can identify easily in the same way that you could with a toxic norm. And so I think this makes it more difficult to sort of organize collectively. And because they're often imposed by people with direct power over you, it makes it harder to speak up about them, right? Because it means that you are very vulnerable to retaliation, right? You're very vulnerable to sort of professional repercussions. Okay, so I think that it's a little bit, depends on your situation, but I think starting by identifying sort of trusted friends and accomplices who you think you can at least share it with and get support from is an important first step, right? And I think shining, at the end of the day, like shining a light on the situation is, it's so necessary because like these things cannot stand when they're like brought into the full daylight. This is the reason people don't want you to talk about it with other people. This is the reason people don't want you to tell it to other people, right? They don't want you to know that it's not okay. But again, you don't owe anyone anything. Okay, so like I think in all of these things, it's something that you just have to take at the pace that's right for you. And I think that it's important to navigate at sort of your level of safety, right? The most important thing is for you to be safe, and for you to get to a place where you feel that you are not any longer sort of in harm's way. Okay, so a little bit heavy, a little bit hard, but I think in all of this, like the people around you can make a world of difference. Okay, so I did have some discussion questions, but I think we'll skip them for now because I know there's going to be time for question and answers at the end. So I think I want to just sort of finish highlighting sort of these strategies that I'm talking about. I think the next one is probably the most concrete and is really, really important, which is documentation. Documentation as a defense against gaslighting. Okay, so gaslighting, another explanatory comma, it refers to the act of like undermining another person's reality by denying facts, the environment around them, or their feelings. I think this is sort of a very common thing whenever there is sort of either toxic or pseudo norms at play, where people want to make you feel like you expecting to be treated better or sort of naming these as problems, that you're the problem. Everybody else is fine with what's happening. You just can't hack it. You're just not good enough at math. You're just not committed enough to this profession. You just don't want it bad enough. And I think one good way to make sure that you don't sort of succumb to that pressure is by keeping track of the things that are happening. Okay, so I think, right, like these norms persist because we get convinced that our experiences are not as bad as we know them to be, or that they're a result of our own personal failings and not caused by sort of a toxic environment. And so I think if you can document things, you can record things, then as they happen, then eventually you have the laundry list to prove all the things that you've gone through. And anytime anyone wants to minimize it as like, oh, well, this is just this little thing, and this is just this little thing, and that is just that little thing, you can be like, no, it's all of these things. It is all of these things. And all of these things are not okay. And I think this is especially true for pseudo norms, because toxic norms, it's a little bit easier to get buy-in from the people around you when you start to point out the problem, because other people are also feeling the problem, right? They're also hurting. They might not want to acknowledge it, but they usually are. Whereas with pseudo norms, if other people around you aren't experiencing it, it can be really easy to convince yourself that you're the problem. And so it's just as much important as for your sort of your own sanity as it is to sort of document it for other people, right? To be like, no, like I know this is what happened. Here it is. Okay. And this can also be important if the experience that you're having is to the point that you want to report it through official channels, right? If you want to report it to the chair of your department, if you want to report it to Title IX, if you want to sort of escalate things, having documentation of what has happened is going to be crucial in making that case. And so I think this is important personally so that you don't feel like you're being bullied out of your own experience. But I think it's also important if you ever want to escalate things further, depending on how serious your experience has been and depending on like what energy levels you have to pursue something, right? Okay. And so finally, step 4, don't become a toxic norm enforcer. Okay, right? How do toxic norms persist? They persist because we enforce them, right? Norms only happen in communities because communities uphold those norms. Okay, and so the sooner that we decide that we don't want things like this, right? It's like what I said before, like toxic norms crumble in the face of a caring and supportive community. And so we can help make that happen by not enforcing the norms that we have experienced on other people, right? So for example, don't become the person who's like, well, I had to go through it and it wasn't so bad. You'll be fine, right? That's an easy one to fall into. You sort of, it's like the survivorship bias. You made it through, you're okay. So why can't other people deal with it too? Okay, don't do that. And I think the one that's probably the most common and is like sort of the most, is the primary reason that toxic norms are perpetuated is just the sort of ease of staying with the status quo, right? We've always done it this way. It's how it's always been, right? An unwillingness to disrupt the status quo keeps us perpetuating the same cycles of harm without even recognizing the harm that we're doing. Okay, we need to be willing to say what we're doing is not working because it is not valuing people in the way they deserve to be. And we need to be willing to try something new. We cannot just continue to do the same thing because it's what we've always done. Of course, okay? And then finally, of course, we don't want to be a toxic norm enforcer, but we do want to enforce some norms, right? Good norms also need to be enforced, okay? And so those also are things that we can decide as a community to set intentionally, to revisit frequently, and to enforce and to implement, right? There's no use in having a code of conduct at a conference if when someone breaks it, you're just like, oh, dang, they should have been nicer, right? You need to have follow through. You need to hold people accountable, right? You need to have consequences. And so just like we don't want to enforce toxic norms, we should also start to think carefully about what norms we do want to have in place and how we can support those, right? How we can make those the common experience in our communities. Okay, so quick recap, right? Think about whether it's a toxic norm or pseudo norm, right? Think about how you're experiencing it, who else is experiencing it, what dynamics and power dynamics are at play. Think about the ways that you can plug into community to help you survive and thrive through this, to help you change the norms around you. Document your experience, okay? Write it down as it happens, keep track, keep emails, right? Make a Dropbox folder if you need to, but like write it down, okay? And then don't keep perpetuating the same harm that you've experienced, and think about how you can replace that harm with good. Okay, so what I want to end with, okay, is the following, which is just an affirmation of what everyone here deserves. Okay, you deserve to be treated with utmost dignity and respect. You deserve to have your mathematical talent nurtured and supported. You deserve to be treated as an expert on your own experience. You deserve to be recognized as complete and complex human being with identities and experiences that materially impact the way you are treated in mathematical spaces. You deserve to voice your experiences and concerns without suffering retaliation or professional harm. You deserve justice and restorative care. And I'll go ahead and end there. Thanks, everybody.